Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Laura Pistarfi, and I'm a board member with the Plant Initiative, the organization that's hosting this event today. The mission of the Plant Initiative is to increase respectful treatment of plants, and especially to advance advocacy for plants through encouraging policy, law, and activism on behalf of plants. Our organization does that through education, including events like this, as well as partnerships and collaborations with grants to organizations working for plant advocacy. So we have a wonderful conversation today, and our helpers today are two of our board members, Maya Hummel and Sue Fager, who you will see in the chat and helping with the Q&A. And our conversationalist today is Paul Moss, who is a co-founder and the executive director of the Plant Initiative. We're very, very grateful today to have Dr. Marc Bekoff with us. Dr. Bekoff is a professor emeritus of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's published 31 books, or 41 if you count his many volumes and encyclopedias. He's won many awards for his research and is an expert on animal behavior, animal emotions, compassionate conservation, and animal protection. He's worked with Jane Goodall and is a former Guggenheim Fellow. Of his many books, he's recently authored several on dogs, and his forthcoming Dogs Demystified, an A to Z Guide to All Things Canine will be published in 2023. He regularly publishes for Psychology Today and works closely with inmates at the Boulder County Jail. In 2022, he was recognized as a hero by the Academy of Dog Trainers. He's also published a number of essays on plants recently, and that's why we're here today to hear more about Marc, about his thoughts on plants. So please join me in welcoming Marc Bekoff, and Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks very much, Laura. So I just am very grateful again, join Laura in saying we're very pleased and honored that Marc Bekoff is going to be having a conversation with us today. There'll be an opportunity for questions from the attendees, and what we'd ask you to do is to just put your questions in the chat, and then after Marc and I have a conversation for about 25 minutes or so, then we'll be opening up to the questions that you'll be posting in chat. Thanks very much for that. You know, the first thing I would like to just ask you, Marc, is just, you know, a lot of your work, or most of your work, has really focused on animal behavior, cognition, and ethics. And could you just share a little bit about how and why you've maybe come to think about plants in that context?
Yeah, well, I started reading about the work done on, you know, the, if you will, the cognitive and emotional lives of plants, and they're living beings, and so I'm interested in living beings, and I eat a lot of them, so I figured I might as well learn more about them. But it's part of my ethic that they're alive and they should be treated with respect, each and every individual one, which is problematic with. I mean, it's problematic with non-human animals since there's so many of them, but that's kind of the guiding light, that every individual life matters, which is really the foundation of compassionate conservation, applied mostly to, you know, animals, if you will, but still, you know, plants are living beings, so we might as well understand them and figure out what's happening in their lives.
Mm-hmm. How would you come to think about what is happening in plants' lives? Are there some things that we could learn from plants themselves about what they want to flourish, or to better understand what they would, you know, if we want to treat them respectfully, are there some ways in which we can approach them, given that you know, they're so different than animals in many ways?
Yeah, I've thought of that question, and I'm not sure. I mean, I would like to believe that somehow they all would like to live. I know people laugh when I say that, but you know, that they'd all have some kind of survival instinct and would like to continue the lives they're supposed to have. And And I suppose that's all packed with a lot of stuff with beliefs and desires and intentionality that philosophers like to write volumes on. Um, but that would be it. They're part of the natural, they're part of the world. They're a diverse group of organisms. And I think we need we need to learn more about, if you will, who they are. I guess you could say what they are, but I like to use the word who to refer to other beings. And people have said to me, well, you use who for animals. I do. A lot of people still refer to them as that or which or it's, but you use who for animals because you believe they're sentient, they're not property, they have feelings and desires. But the research that I'm reading about in plants doesn't discount that possibility. Okay, I'm not a botanist and I can't really say much more than that, but I love looking at them. They make me feel good when I go hike or ride my bike on gravel trails or in the mountains. So I figure the best way to change what's happening to our planet is to understand who all the occupants are, including flora.
Yeah. Do you think that there's, I like what you're saying about, that it's helpful to understand who they are in terms of, how we may relate to them. Do you think that there's some, but I know that your beliefs go extend beyond just animals and plants to all living beings. So is there a way in which although it's important to understand, who plants are and their attributes, is it necessary to do that in order that they be treated respectfully? Is it contingent? Is the idea to treat living beings based on the specific characteristics that they have, or is it just more of a global way of looking at all living beings as having intrinsic value and deserving of respect?
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. I mean, it's that each individual has intrinsic or inherent value because they're alive. I mean, it's the same principle with with non-human animals. People will say, well, we don't really know if I'm just a wasp, which isn't true because we know a lot more about insects now. But they'll pick an organism and say, well, we don't really know whether they're sentient. Do they have feelings? We don't really know whether they have active minds. Well, that doesn't mean they're dispensable or disposable. I mean, even if they don't, they still, to me, have a right to live the life that they've evolved to live. So I think what you said capsules it for plants, if you will. They're around. Do they have a will to live? I don't know, but maybe they do. I mean, I don't know. But I imagine they have a will not to be destroyed, whether they feel the pain or not. I mean, it's like with humans and other animals who don't feel pain. That's not an open license to abuse them because they don't feel the pain. I mean, I know people say that and philosophers argue that, and I think it's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah, right. The logic, it doesn't necessarily follow. That just because a being doesn't have certain characteristics, that it doesn't have any value, and that we don't have to respect them. It's kind of a disconnect.
Yeah.
Do you have some thoughts on how we might treat plants more respectfully? I mean, given that they're beings that want to live and maybe beings we don't completely understand, do certain things come to mind maybe from some of your work on animals? But in terms, like with animals, there's the 5 freedoms, and there are various ways of trying to think about how should we be interacting with animals in a way. Do you feel that perhaps thing connected with the 5 freedoms could be relevant to plants, or maybe explain a little bit more to the listeners what the 5 freedoms are and why they're important?
Yeah, I actually started, I did it last year and I was looking for it, but it's somewhere lost. But I started thinking about a generic 5 freedoms for animals and for plants. The 5 freedoms were put forth in Britain in 1965 because of the horrific behavior, the horrific treatment of so-called food animals, animals on factory farms and industrial agriculture. Basically, they're so minimalist, but at the time they were really in advance, whether one wants to accept that, make sure they have adequate food and water, make sure they have space to move around, make sure they're free to perform what they call species characteristic behaviors, and they should be free from intentional harm, which is an oxymoron. I mean, if there's anything more brutal in the world than industrial agriculture, I'm not quite sure what it is. I mean, because they're causing intentional harm every millisecond of the day. But I think you could apply some of those to plants in the sense that if they need a certain space to live and thrive, they need nutrients, food. They should be free to grow. They should be free to do what is species characteristic, if you will. And one of the things people have said to me kind of jokingly, and they laugh at me, but they're my friends, so they can laugh at me all they want. But I mean, one of the, daily activities is like mowing lawns. Somebody once said to me on a bike ride, so you think mowing lawns could be abusive to grass? And I went, uh-huh. And that didn't go very far. But yeah, I mean, cutting flowers, doing certain things. I mean, things that people pretty much routinely do, not intentionally, not wanting to cause intentional harm. But over the years, it's made me think, about different activities that I would do. So it would be just the common everyday things of people going out on a hike and popping a flower because it looks pretty and putting it in their hair, or bringing it home and putting it in a glass of water, which is hardly a natural habitat for them. Yeah.
One of the things that you've talked about in your books has been, using some kind of simple principles, such as, the golden rule. It's not really a simple principle, but it's an easy to understand principle, such as the golden rule or the precautionary principle, and kind of applying them to the way that we relate to all other types of beings on the planet. I wonder if you could talk about both the golden rule and the precautionary principle, and maybe how you see those affecting relationships with plants, or just more broadly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was thinking about the precautionary principle because I like to apply that to non-human animals. That when for people who don't know, I mean, my interpretation is simply when you have enough information that shows, for example, in this case, that an organism, a being might suffer or not like being treated in a certain way, you don't need more. In other words, for animal welfare, which is, animal welfare is as weak as it could be these days, but, we have enough information. We've had enough information for decades to say we shouldn't be doing horrific things to animals in laboratories, or keeping them in cages in zoos, or raising them to go on the end of a fork into someone's mouth, for example. So some people say, well, we need more. No, we don't need more. That's where I would apply the precautionary principle. We've got enough information to make ethically sound decisions, excuse me, and we've had it for a long time. In our book, The Animals Agenda, Jessica Pierce and I developed what we call the knowledge translation gap, which is exactly that, is using the information we have on behalf of other beings. So for people who don't know, the Federal Animal Welfare Act in the United States redefined the word animal to exclude lab rats and mice and birds and fishes and insects. It still obtains today. And what I think is just absolutely, it's heinous that only a few of my colleagues have actually come out and say, well, but they are animals. No, I mean, I know it sounds absurd, but the current version of the Federal Animal Welfare Act says these animals are not animals. So, yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, you know, with respect more to say flora and plants, I mean, I think we've known enough for a really long time, but we certainly know enough today to, if you will, treat them with more respect. And that, of course, opens a lot of doors for different sorts of discussions. But to me, for me to get some of the people I interact with to think that way is really good. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, this knowledge problem of knowledge translation and this knowledge gap, I mean, it is right. There's like a certain willfulness of, you know, wanting to keep sometimes that difference there and wanting to maybe silence scientists on ethical issues and, you know, keeping those two areas apart. You know, one of the things I liked in that you talked about in Animals Agenda was the compassion scene. And it was kind of a way, you know, we hear about the Anthropocene era epoch that we're in, you know, and that's with basically humans dominating the global environment with their activities, often in a destructive way. But I think you're seeing that there's an opportunity for a different type of epic, which you're calling the compassion scene. I wonder if you could talk about that and how that could include not only animals, but other beings as well.
Yeah, I mean, in my book, The Animal Manifesto, I talked about expanding our compassion footprint, you know, sort of as we hopefully decrease our carbon footprint. So years ago in a book called Minding Animals, a lot of people think it's really fluffy. A lot of scientists barfed when I wrote it, but you know, I'm a good scientist. I can do that. But I talked about umbrellas of compassion and respect, you know, increasing the arena, increasing the number of beings who come into the arena of compassion. I mean, nothing's lost by treating I'm using plants in a generic way, but nothing's lost by treating plants with respect. I knew somebody a few years ago, and I never verified it, but who quit his job. I guess he's a tree trimmer. He was. And he really felt he was harming the trees. And of course, people laughed at him. And he said, I just can't do this anymore. If a tree branch wants to, you know, if a tree branch wants to grow in that direction, then let it, you know, so I think the world will be a better place when plants are incorporated into this big, if you will, arena of compassion. We don't realize how much we depend on them both psychologically and physically until we don't have them anymore.
Mm-hmm. You know, you've written a lot about the animal rights movement and animal ethics. And I think that, you know, the animal rights movement has really made a difference for animals. I realize that maybe in terms of the raw numbers of animals that are still being abused, that's grown, and that there's still many challenges ahead. But yet I think in terms of raising public awareness and having certain types of, you know, laws moving, regulations moving in the right direction, it's been helpful. Do you feel that there are some lessons that could be learned from the animal advocacy movement that would be useful for those interested in plant advocacy?
Yeah, I think one would be giving plants the benefit of the doubt. You know, looking at one thing, you know, I'm just going to go in another direction for a minute, but when I look at the scientific work, but also there's a lot of common sense here too. I mean, but the scientific work on plant cognition and sentience, say, the information on animal sentience looked like that maybe 200 years ago. You know, I mean, Darwin was already writing about sentience. People who think that, you know, sentience just came on the scene recently just, you know, are completely wrong. So when Darwin and others were writing about animal cognition and animal sentience centuries ago, they didn't have a lot of science to go on. They had a lot of, you know, intuition. And, you know, maybe also from living with their dogs and their cats and companion animals and other beings like that. So I think that a lesson that I learned, and I talk with people about it, is that, you know, with this growing field of plant sentience, just to have a name for it right now, there's every reason to believe that there's something going on there in a world that's really different from the one in which we typically, the one in which we think about these sorts of things, that a plant could have feelings, that a plant knows something or learns something, you know. And my reading of the plant learning literature, you know, it's seems like it's kind of what we were doing years ago when we were studying animal learning. So I think the lesson is, the overall lesson is keep the door open. I mean, nothing's lost by keeping the door open. And if people going out into nature have the belief or the thought that the plants, you know, can have inner lives, you'd hope it would only improve their lives, unless they're sickies like the people who abuse animals.
Well, you know, in a lot of ways, you know, this difference between plants and animals is kind of like a duality. And I know you've spoken about dualities in your books, and you know, but you know, we have common ancestors, plants and animals, you know, and the same functionality that plants and, you know, that animals have, plants also have, even if they do that things in a different way. So I mean, I personally think that, you know, it's possible that, you know, terminology like sentience, intelligence can be applied really to any living being, including, you know, microorganisms as well. I mean, it's something that's innate, and it expresses itself differently in different types of organisms. And maybe it's hard to recognize in different types of organisms, but every organism has to, you know, take in information from the environment. It has to kind of weigh that information, all the different stimuli that it has. It has to make intelligent decisions so that it can continue to survive. And, you know, that all animals and plants and microorganisms all have to do that, or else they would, they're not automatons. They're having to kind of weigh all the different options that they
Yeah. I mean, you summed it really concisely. That's exactly how I feel. And that with what I'm learning, or what I've learned and what I'm learning, I look at plants differently. I mean, I always talk to trees. I mean, because when I lived in the mountains, I was surrounded by pine trees, and people would just think I was absolutely whacked. I think people would avoid me when I would run my dogs down the boulder bike path or go hiking, and I'd stop and I'd say hello to a tree. You know, I mean, why not? You know, I mean, I don't know I mean, once again, you know, somebody said to me, well, do you think they really are responding? And I said, I don't really know, but then there's that literature that when you touch a tree, you are causing shade or changes in temperature that could affect the tree metabolism. Or these studies that have been done that some scientists did, you know, that when they are looking at plants, or, you know, doing population surveys, if they cast a shadow, they could be changing the behavior of the plant. I mean, I never really thought about that before. So for me, just having those ideas in my head really changed the way that I try to interact with the plant world, you know, if you will. Yeah.
You know, you mentioned that people, you know, look kind of askance, or look kind of strangely on people that talk with trees or hug trees. Why do you think it's threatening to people? That, you know, a person might treat a plant respectfully like that, or engage in affectionate touch with a plant. Why do you think it bothers? Why should it bother anyone?
I think it could bother people and put them on the defensive because they think you're right. I mean, a lot of that comes up with, you know, say veganism, or, you know, people's meal plans. They'd rather avoid talking about certain things because it makes them feel uncomfortable, or they think by ridiculing you, not that you'll change. Well, maybe they think ridiculing you, you'll change your mind, but by ridiculing you, it's a demeaning thing, you know. Frankly, it doesn't bother me anyway, because I get that. I've been getting that for decades, you know. And you know, I work with Jane Goodall. She's been getting it for decades too. Oh yeah, really? These chimpanzees have personalities. I mean, this is like 60-something years ago, and they have personalities. And guess what? They had them then. They had them centuries ago, and they have them now. So I think it makes people uneasy because you're challenging the way they see the world and their place in the world. I think it's a great question, Paul, because they're on the defensive and they want to put you on the defensive. And I just don't think that people who think plants have a right to life and plants should be treated with respect, and that we're learning more and more about their inner lives, if you will. I don't think there's anything to defend at all. I mean, you know, I always say, go get a beer. I'm not defending this. I don't have to.
You know, we were chatting a little before the program started about the issue with, you know, eating plants. And, you know, it's something that everyone has to do either directly or indirectly, because either they're eating, you know, plants or plant products, or they're eating animal products, which originally people were eating, those animals were eating plants. And I think one of the concerns that sometimes gets raised about issues of respect for plants is that, you know, how do we go about living with plants when we have to kill them in order to eat them? Do you have any thoughts on how you respond to people that raise issues like that?
Nothing that's real. I mean, yeah, nothing that's really, I'm not sure, well-based. I mean, from my reading of what we're learning about the inner lives of plants, I don't quite see, I don't have the words. I just don't quite see where they, for example, might experience the same pain. You know, I mean, the pain and suffering that a non-human animal, I don't know that. Okay. And you are taking a life, you know, you're eating a carrot. So I think for me, it's more of a practical issue, and not feel like I'm taking a life, and the organism, if you will, knows that I'm taking a life. It's not, like I said, I mean, I'm not going to BS you. I don't have anything that's really well-founded other than that right now. I don't think, you know, people have said to me, because I've been vegan for a long time, oh, when you bite a carrot, do you think they scream in pain? I mean, you know, probably everyone's heard that. I don't think they do. I mean, that's all I really can say. I don't think they do. And then of course people say, well, what if you learn that they do? Well, if I learn that they do, then I and a lot of people might have to change our meal plans. I mean, you know, but
well, I think like in indigenous, not to be too broad brush, but in indigenous cultures, I mean, it's not necessarily immoral, you know, to take a life, cause pain, and that it's a recognition that we all live in reciprocity and that we're all dependent on each other. And that's kind of the nature of the way that this Earth and our ecosystems have been set up, is that, but I think there's ways of allowing, for respectful use, not wasting plant lives. There's in some cultures like the Jain culture,
Yeah.
that not eating maybe a carrot or root vegetables because then you're killing the entire plant. There's ways of eating maybe just leaves or fruit or seeds. Not that every plant part wouldn't necessarily have some degree of sentience, but still it's a complicated issue, and there isn't really any like maybe moral high ground in a way in dealing with plants, and that we do have to kill them and eat them. So, but I think really the indigenous cultures have a lot to teach people about respectful ways of interacting with plants.
Yeah, no, I agree. Years ago, I went to a couple of Native American meetings. I was the only white guy, and I wasn't allowed to take notes or ask questions or do anything. But at the end, they asked me what I thought. It was a man called Vine Deloria who invited me. And he said, we don't usually have people like you at our meetings. And he wasn't being insulting. So I went to at least one, maybe two, one in Boulder. And yeah, I came away from it. I mean, I'm agreeing totally with what you said, Paul. They asked me at the end what was some of my thoughts, and I was honest, because they could read right through you. I said, I wish you didn't do some of the things you did to animals, non-human animals, but I know you're doing with respect, and your culture really honors cycle of life, types of views. So, that's all I could say. I wish you didn't kill these animals for food or kill them for clothes, but who am I to say, what you should or shouldn't do? But it is this complete, I think what you were getting to, that, this complete integration of life on the planet, that we're one massive community. And we are borrowing constantly from different corners of that community. And I can only hope that we're then giving back, if you will, you can't quantify 10 units, but if we're taking something, we're giving back, we maintaining some kind of homeostasis. Yeah. So I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. At this point, I know that I'm seeing that there's been some questions that have been posted. Yep. So let's take the remainder of our hour today. And Sue, I think you'll be relaying some of these questions to Mark.
I am. Lots of great comments, Mark. But the first question is there any good literature or research on domestication of flora or fauna historically and it working harmoniously?
Gosh, I don't know, to be honest with you. I don't know that literature. There's a book called Domestication that's pretty good. I mean, some of what Darwin wrote on domestication pretty much still stands today. But I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay. The next question was from someone who loves your work on animal play. And she wonders what you think about play occurring in plant communities.
Oh gosh, somebody once asked me that, and I said I just don't know. I mean, how plants. I'm not quite sure how they could play with one another in terms of the voluntary movements of saying, one rose says to a rose, or a tulip says to a rose, "Come play with me." I'm not being facetious, but I don't know, and I've never read about that. One of the fascinating things I once read about there's a man, E.O. Wilson, who sadly passed away a couple of sometime within the last year, and he was an ant specialist, and he once published or some observations where he wondered whether ants, when they got together, were playing with their tentacles or something like that. I loved it because I had not thought about it, but I don't know. Yeah, I mean, by any definition of play, it seems there's a rapid exchange, like when dogs play on the run. You know, I'm playing with you, and I do something, you do something, and sometimes it's kind of the golden rule of play, I call it, where you do something and I'm not sure if you're playing, so I'll step back, and then you'll do a behavior pattern that says, I didn't mean to bite you or mount you or slap you. I still want to play. So in some ways, play requires somewhat of a theory of mind. I'm not saying plants don't have it. I just can't imagine what it would look like. That's a great question. I'll be pondering that later.
Okay. Someone else would like to know if you have any tactics for talking to the public about treating trees with respect, particularly developers who come into neighborhoods and cut down old trees to build new buildings.
Be nice to them. I once stopped on a bike ride. I asked these guys what they were doing. And it might have been the time when this guy quit his job ultimately, but they were cutting trees down and putting them through one of those things. What do you call them? The shredder, you know, the thing that shoots out the bark. There's a scene in one of the James Bond movies of a guy going through one of them, which isn't, I think it's on Her Majesty's Secret Service. And they said, we're cutting trees. And I said, do you think they mind? And I was shocked, actually. Only one blew me off and said, oh, you're just a Boulder guy. You know, you would ask that kind of question. The other people said, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't think so. The answer was, I don't know, but I don't think so. But what I do with my friends, and I really, really mean this, is that, I'll just talk to them and I'll say, don't blow me off. You don't know any more than I do. I don't know whether they feel things, but I'll leave the door open, and you don't know that they don't. I mean, it's this whole argument, in the animal cognition, animal emotions literature, where they'll say, well, you don't really know that elephants feel joy. Well, of course I do. And I'll say, but you don't really know that they don't. And that's kind of a conversation stopper, which is good because they don't know the animals don't feel joy or pain. They just assume they don't, probably because they abuse or eat them. One big fan of trees, I'll just say this is really interesting because I've been talking with Joan Baez, the singer, about different things because she rescues animals, and she did some of the original drawings for my new book, which is really nice. And she loves trees, and she goes out and talks to trees. And not in a light way either. She doesn't do that lightly. So she got me thinking about it once when we were talking a couple of months ago, and she said, I had a question about something, and she said, well, I'm going out on a walk and I'll ask some of the trees what they think. I love that kind of thing. She wasn't trying to be cute or anything. That's where she comes out.
Okay. The next question was one about invasive plants. How do we treat them with respect while ensuring native plants are able to thrive and thus preserve biodiversity?
Sorry, I have a very dry throat. I think I look at them in the same way that I do, quote, invasive animals. I mean, we're the invasive animal. A lot of invasive animals are where they are now because of us, and a lot of invasive plants are where they are because we brought them to where they are. So I'm against killing them. I mean, for sure. And maybe there's ways to stop their growth in the future. It's kind of like birth control for invasive plants. I once suggested that to somebody and they kind of liked it. It really came to me on the spur of the moment. I really hadn't thought about that kind of thing. But I think a lot of the question on invasive organisms really comes down to the use of the word and the cause for where they are. I mean, in the mountains, there's people who go, and I think it's great. They're picking invasive plants. I had some on my property. I didn't even know they were really beautiful. They look good. And so they said, do you mind if we take them? And I said, well, I really wish you wouldn't, but if it makes you feel better, you can take a few. And they said, well, they're smothering out the natives. And that, of course, gets you into the long conversation of what native and non-native means. And I don't mean that in a trivial way at all. So I think if we can have reasonable, there's a lot more people today who don't want to kill invasive animals, although New Zealand has a war on animals where the people down there love killing millions of invasive sentient beings, but they're there because of the people. But on the plant side of things, if I could get them to think about what they're doing and the words they're using, to me, that's somewhat of an achievement, because there's a lot of people who are much more open to those sorts of arguments for animals rather than plants because they don't think plants have feelings. Yeah.
Okay. Someone else wanted to know if you were familiar with music of plants machines. When you have one connected to a plant, you can see and hear how your interaction with the plant changes its energy field.
I don't, but I recently posted an interview with a woman on Site Today, and I can't remember the name of the book. I can see if I can find it on my computer, but I'd probably get rid of the Zoom because I'm not really computer facile. But it's a book about how new technology is allowing us to hear plants and non-human animals and plants and the sounds of nature. So no, I don't know about the machine, but I love listening to wind going through trees. And I have no idea what's going on, but I love when it changes. But that might not necessarily be noise that's being produced by the plant, endogenously, but it wouldn't surprise me that plants, I haven't thought about this, that plants make sounds. They've got fluids going through their bark and their roots. So no, I don't. Maybe that's where we're here. Please don't eat me. I don't know, but it opens the door for a lot of things.
This is our last question that's been put in the chat box. What is research that you've been exploring on plant cognitive abilities, and who are some of the scientists in the field?
I don't remember the name. A woman named Monica. I can't remember her last name now. She wrote a book on a couple of years ago.
Monica Gagliano.
Yeah, right. So her work. Oh, and then, I think I can do this. There's a new book called Plant Sapiens. It's been out for a while, and it's coming out in the States. And Paco Calvo, who's it's called the Lab of Minimal Intelligence in Spain. So it'd be PACO CALVO and Monica Gagliano. Peter Wohlleben, who's written all these books about the secret life of animals and trees. I read his stuff. I just don't remember the authors of the research. If you do a web search on plant intelligence or plant sentience, you will find a lot of names. I loved doing it a couple of weeks ago after Paul contacted me just to see how hot the field is, and it's a hot field, as it should be.
Okay. Those are all the questions we have.
I can step up with some more questions.
Okay.
I'm going to take advantage of the fact that we have Marc here for the hour, and if anyone is thinking that they have some additional questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. One of the things you've been calling for, like in Rewilding Our Hearts, has been like a paradigm shift. one that is going to value, over everything else. And, how might that occur, and how might that connect with the way people treat plants?
Yeah, that's a great thing. I was thinking about that a few days ago, but yeah, rewilding our hearts was really a call for personal rewilding. They call it from the inside out, letting your heart direct your actions, letting your feelings direct your actions. And I wrote in there, but I hadn't really filled it out very much more. Maybe I will now. Part of rewilding is appreciating our surroundings, which would be the flora and the fauna. So part of personal rewilding to plants would be considering, if you will, their inner lives, what they want. Do they have desires? What would they like? And like I said before, I mean, I suppose if you could ask them, I can't imagine that there wouldn't be a plant that would say, oh, I don't really care. I mean, once again, I mean that they have a will to live. They want to live their lives. I mean, when I say that to people, they walk away because they think I'm just psychotic, but that's okay. I might be, but not because of that. But seriously, I think your question's a good one, Paul. That rewilding, because in rewilding our hearts, I talk about rewilding in terms of reconnecting to nature, and plants are part of nature. Yeah. And actually I had a young kid to me. Oh yeah, it just was this past summer. I was riding my bike into town on a bike path, and somehow there's all these classes around, kids going out, elementary school kids, and they're looking at all the little insects and the flowers. And this little girl said to me, she was like 6 years old. I just stopped. I said, well, what are you all doing? I mean, I love seeing the kids out there. And she said, well, we're looking at the insects, and look at this flower. This flower is this insect's home. I mean, it was revelatory to her. So I don't know if it's going to change her life any, but I kept saying, well, tell me more. And she had the greatest story about how the insect goes out and flies around and maybe sees its friends and then goes back to the flowers, and that's their home. And I said, do you think the insect really would miss their home? And she said, oh, of course they would. I mean, it was like, there's my hope for the future. But that was really revelatory to me, that this little girl looking at this flower and realizing it was someone's home. And that's a rewilding experience. Yeah.
This issue of freedom and agency really has come up a lot in your work about, the animals deserve to have freedom, and, that we should respect their agency. Do you feel that's an approach that would work with plants? I mean, in a way, plants are challenged because, plants with agency and freedom often are not doing things that people really want them to do, like they're weeds, or they're growing in a way
Right.
that people don't like. But I mean, it's a very compelling argument for animals, in my opinion. I just wonder how you think that might apply freedom and other values.
Yeah, I think they're parallel. They parallel one another really nicely. I just read a book called Pests. Did an interview with the woman who wrote it, and so much of what we feel about these organisms are in the words we use, like pests and trash and invasives. So, right. I mean, it's hard in a generic way for me to think of any individual who wouldn't want to have the most freedoms in their lives. But for a lot of people, having certain freedoms would not be good for them or for the world. I don't mean that facetious. I mean, I've worked with inmates, and they would agree that having the freedom to do some of the things they did was not a good thing. But within the context of natural behaviors, within the context of looking at the positive side, I think the freer an organism can be to express themselves in if you will, good ways, and that there's a lot packed in there, but in ways that don't influence the community negatively, would be what we all want. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm not sure I could say much more. I hadn't thought about that, but I mean, when I lived in the mountains, and I mean, I live in Boulder now because we had a flood, and I don't really have any lawn to mow, and I never would. But when I lived in the mountains, I had some nice land, and it was all grasses and all that. And I never ever cut one down. Not necessarily because of the ethical thing. It just seemed like the dumbest thing I could do in the world is mow it this week and mow it the next week and stuff. But we had some major fires, and part of the fire mitigation was they came in and cleaned it out. And they kept cleaning it out. And the guy said to me, well, why didn't you cut it? And I said, well, it would just grow right back. I mean, I wasn't trying to be an ass about it. It was like, why would I cut it? It's beautiful, waving in the wind in the mountains. So maybe I was granting those grasses the freedom to be who they want to be. Yeah.
Thanks. I think Sue has some more questions.
Yeah, sure.
I do, Mark. Do you have any thoughts about how humans can best reflect perspectives in developing and implementing post-humanist legal and regulatory systems, or who speaks for this?
I don't know what quite post-humanism is. I've read about it. Can whoever asked that question tell me more? I mean, if post-human means beyond human, I mean, because Jessica Pierce and I wrote a book about what we call post-human dogs, and these weren't philosophical dogs. They were post-human dogs who were living after all the humans in the world disappeared. How would post-human dogs live? But I'm not. I know yeah. Sorry, a lot of.
I think I'm not the person that asked the question, but to me, post-humanism means just kind of going beyond humans as the center of all the focus and in something. So it's more like going beyond humans as the center of the world.
Yeah. Well, part of the description for our dog, for our book, A Dog's World, imagining the lives of dogs in a world without humans, was precisely that. It was decentering humans and, getting away from the self-centered, arrogant, self-serving, narrow, whatever you want to call it, human arrogance and human exceptionalism. So I think these discussions on plants and Paul's question about rewilding and plants can help get us there, that we're not the center of the universe. And that doesn't demean, I mean, if somebody says you're not the center of things, that's great. Who wants to be number one? But like, yeah, I mean, we're a community, we're all interconnected. And I think the other aspect of rewilding and factoring in the, flora and fauna is that, to me, it stresses the interconnectedness of every living organism, if you will, in the universe. So I think that's what the moves for animals, Steve Wise and his group and others who are trying to bring personhood to non-human animals, are really decentering humans as being the only, if you will, persons in the world. And dogs and non-humans are objects in legal systems throughout the world. It's the dumbest thing in the world. They're not objects. Dogs, non-humans and plants can't be murdered. But of course they can be murdered. But it's legal systems that are centered on human exceptionalism that preclude the use of the word murder and preclude the use of the word persons to refer to those beings. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah.
Okay. What about houseplants? Are they captive? How do we treat them with compassion?
Well, I actually don't. It's weird. I really like having them, but I'm a space cadet when it comes to watering them. So every Christmas, I just got one yesterday. A friend of mine gives me an amaryllis plant that just blooms, and I don't have to feel responsible for he or she. It's a good question. If they're not mobile and you can keep them in reasonable ways where they flourish, seems okay to me. I mean, I'm just saying, I haven't been asked that. Yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah, I mean, I know people who get trees in their house, and I can't imagine that after a while, the root system doesn't feel like it's in really too compact a housing, if you will. So I would have to say, it's like getting a companion animal. Certain dogs would be better for certain lifestyles. So pick one out pick one out for whom you allow them to do what's natural for them, within your world. Yeah. Bringing a Great Dane into an apartment in New York City, you might as well just get a horse. Yeah, pick the one who would suit, where they could express their natural behaviors. Yeah, that gets back to the 5 freedoms. I really had not thought about that, Paul. So there might be a paper there about the 5 freedoms for plants. Yeah.
All right, one last question, then we'll have time for Laura to wrap it up. And it's a big one, Mark.
Uh-oh, let me sit down again.
Okay, get ready.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Because everything, even what we don't consider to be alive, interacts with and is changed by its environment on a chemical, physical level. Do you think plants and single-cell organisms are hard to talk about because saying they have consciousness eventually leads to saying that atoms have preference and or consciousness?
Wow. That is a hard one, but for me, it's an easy one. And I don't mean it in a dispensive, I don't really know. But I mean, once again, I just don't think there's anything lost by keeping the door open. So there are scientists, very well credentialed, who think that I use the word thing, animals aren't things. I don't want to call plants things, but everything in the world is sentient. And these are bright people, bright men and women. So it's not like they're throwing it out there in order to, cause a ruckus or, to have an article written in the New York Times about them, which is doom when they do it anyway. But so I don't know. I really think maybe the best way, since we're almost over and you can attack me on email, but no, I don't really mean it that way. I just think there's nothing lost by thinking of every living being in the world, plant, animal, and whatever other categories there are, as being intimately connected in a community where nothing is lost by respecting their place in that community. People talk about single cell organisms, and then, you get sick and you think that, it's like COVID. I had a long talk with a person who's an immunologist. You're talking about these microscopic things that are changing the world. Are they doing it intentionally? I don't think so, but I don't know. But when you really begin to think how vulnerable human and non-human animals and plants are to these tiny little things, maybe atoms, I don't know. I mean, I know people say, oh, I said this to somebody recently. I said, oh, come on, you're brighter than that. And what I really wanted to say is, I think I'm pretty bright. I do okay on IQ tests, but what's lost by thinking that an atom might have some agency? I mean, I think that's what the question is getting to. And, I talk to a lot of people who are physicists about whether there's anything such as forever, because that's really my view. So I sit on the couch, I look over the Front Range, and I think there's no end to it. But I know people do mathematical models to say that when you get a certain distance away from the Earth, it turns back on itself. So it's finite. But I don't care. I love looking out and thinking that there's no such thing as there is such thing as forever. What I'm looking at goes on for forever. The reason I mention that is because you can model it and you can do a lot of things with animals and plants, but it doesn't mean that you're reflecting reality. What do you think? do I need to commit myself? But I don't think there's anything lost with thinking of every single particle, if you will, as being part of a community. I really, yeah. Because then it becomes completely speciesist. You could say atoms don't count, but then you're a speciesist. I don't know.
Thank you so much, Mark.
No, this is wonderful. Thank you.
This is a wonderful, wonderful place for our conversation. I love how we've moved from plants and animals almost all the way into panpsychism here.
No, it's all connected. I mean, it's all connected, and many people, I would not name some of them, and I don't mean that in either a facetious way, but many people who I find to be really remarkable people, and you would too, go that route. There's nothing to be lost, because the minute you start making these boundaries, you become non-inclusive and exclusionary, which is destroying the world in many ways. How's that for an end? I like that. No,
I think that's a great place. A great place. I wish we could keep talking about this all day.
Yeah, this is great.
But I do have to say thank you so much for this conversation, and we so appreciate your time and all of your thoughts here. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Sue and Maya. And also, I just want to say this conversation was hosted by the Plant Initiative, as I mentioned at the beginning. And thank you also to everyone who's come today. And thanks to those who gave a donation to the Plant Initiative, a nonprofit organization, to help us do our work like this event. And for those of you who are here, if you'd like to offer a donation, I'm going to put our link in the chat. So you can consider that as well. But thank you again, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, and thank you for having me, and for everyone who came. It means a lot to me, and I look forward to sharing this link with many, many people. So,
thank you so much, Mark.
You
Thank
bet.
you.
Take care.
Bye.